I won't marry a broken mobster, Mother. He's paralyzed. Look at him sitting in that wheelchair. I'd rather die than be tied to a cripple. Quiet, Chloe. Sheridan will take your place. No, please, don't do this to me. When Chloe Combs refused to marry the feared syndicate chairman Kwon Hyun-jun, her mother didn't cancel the wedding. She simply chose a different daughter. To everyone watching, this looked like a life sentence. Who would want to spend forever bound to a man the underworld had already left for dead in a wheelchair? But no one in that ballroom knew that Chairman Kwon Hyun-jun was holding a secret so precise, so dangerous, that by the time it surfaced, every person who'd wronged him would wish they'd chosen their next move more carefully. Before we start, if your own mother traded you like currency to save herself, would you ever forgive her? Tell me in the comments. And let me know what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's find out what happens when a stolen bride marries a man wearing his own weakness like a mask. Morning light spilled gold across the Combs estate, but the house didn't feel like morning. It felt like the hour before a funeral. A week earlier, the papers had run the story on every front page in the city. Chairman Kwon Hyun-jun, paralyzed in an ambush that should have killed him. The wedding that had been headline news for months had suddenly become something else entirely, a countdown no one wanted to watch. No one in the house was more unraveled by it than Chloe. She'd been promised to Hyun-jun long before the accident, back when marrying him meant marrying power. Now it meant marrying a man the whole underworld had already buried in their minds. Sheridan moved through the kitchen the way she always did, unseen. She rinsed the last of the breakfast dishes, wiped down a table she hadn't been allowed to sit at in years, and kept her eyes low. Ever since her father died, this had become her entire world. Small, silent, useful. Alina ran the house now. Chloe got the privileges, and Sheridan got the mop. She didn't yet know that within the hour, her stepmother would call her into the drawing room, hand her a wedding dress that wasn't hers, and change the direction of her life forever. She thought she was walking toward a funeral. She had no idea she was walking toward the one man who could finally set her free. By nightfall, Sheridan would be standing at an altar in her stepsister's place, staring into the eyes of a man everyone feared and no one understood, unaware that the broken chairman across from her hadn't lost a single step. She had no idea, because by the time the sun set behind the estate walls, there was no wheelchair-bound stranger left to fear. There was only the ceremony itself, close and suffocating, pulling her toward it like a tide she couldn't fight. Alina stood in the doorway of the dressing room with the gown draped over her arm like it weighed nothing at all, though Sheridan knew better. That dress had been fitted for Chloe. Every seam, every pearl sewn along the bodice had been chosen for a body that wasn't hers. And yet here was her stepmother, holding it out like a gift instead of a leash. "Put it on," Alina said. "Not a request, never a request." "Mother, I told you." Chloe's voice cracked from the hallway, high and frantic, the sound of a woman who had spent her whole life getting her way and had just discovered, for the first time, that the world had limits after all. "I am not marrying a man who can't even walk me down the aisle himself. Do you understand what people will say about me?" "They'll say nothing," Alina answered, "because you won't be the one standing there." Sheridan stood very still in the center of the room, the way she had learned to stand still years ago, back when stillness was the only thing that kept her safe. She looked at the dress. She looked at her stepmother's face, so composed, so certain, as though she were arranging flowers instead of a daughter's entire future. "I won't do it," Sheridan said quietly. It was the first full sentence she'd spoken to Alina in longer than she could remember. Alina crossed the room in 3 steps and gripped Sheridan's chin between 2 fingers, the way she used to when Sheridan was a girl who'd left a smudge on the good china. "You will do it," she said, "because you have nowhere else to go. You will do it because I have signed your name on papers you never read, and if this alliance fails, so does every roof over your head. You will do it because your father is dead, and dead men don't pay debts." The words landed the way they always did, quiet, precise, aimed exactly at the place that still bled. Sheridan felt something in her chest fold in on itself, small and familiar, the same collapse she'd learned to survive by simply going somewhere else in her mind. She thought of her father's hands on the wheel of a delivery truck, teaching her to read a shipping manifest before she could read a picture book. She thought of the brass pocket watch hidden in the lining of her old coat, the only thing of his Aliner had never found. She did not think of the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. She couldn't afford to. Fear like that needed room to grow, and there was no room left in her. They dressed her in silence. Aliner's maid pinned the veil with sharp, efficient fingers, and Chloe stood in the corner with her arms crossed, watching her stepsister disappear into lace like it was the easiest thing in the world to give away someone else's life. Not once did Chloe offer to trade places back. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry." She only watched, her jaw tight, her eyes flicking toward the window where, somewhere beyond the hedges, the cars were already arriving. And here was the question that would sit in the back of Sheridan's mind for days afterward, small and unanswered. Why had Aliner been in such a hurry? Why had she pushed this marriage forward within a week of the accident, before the ink on the syndicate's grief had even dried, as if she couldn't afford to let Chairman Kwon Hyun-jun change his mind? Or worse, as if she couldn't afford to let anyone look too closely at the timing at all. There wasn't time to chase the thought. The car was already waiting. The ride to the estate was the longest 20 minutes of Sheridan's life. She watched the city blur past the window, gold light, tall buildings, people living lives that had nothing to do with hers, and she pressed her palm flat against her stomach, willing herself not to shake. When the gates finally opened, she saw him for the first time through the tinted glass. Kwon Hyun-jun, seated at the end of a candlelit aisle in a wheelchair polished to a shine, dressed in a black suit that fit him like armor. Guards lined the walls, silent and watchful. Flowers spilled from every corner of the room, white and heavy and smelling like a funeral home. He did not look weak. He did not look broken. He looked like a man waiting for something, and Sheridan couldn't tell if that something was her. She walked down that aisle with her stepmother's hand pressed hard into the small of her back, guiding her the way you'd guide livestock. Every step felt like walking into water that kept rising. The guests whispered behind their programs. Somewhere, a woman gasped, realizing the bride wasn't the daughter the invitations had named. Sheridan kept her eyes down, tears sliding silently over her cheeks, not because she was overwhelmed with love, but because for the first time in years, she understood completely and finally that her life did not belong to her, that it never really had, and that the people who were supposed to protect her had traded her instead. When she finally lifted her eyes to him, Kwon Hyun-jun did not smile. He did not speak, but something in his gaze held her, steady and unreadable like a held breath before a storm no one else in that room could see coming. And in that silence, that terrible, charged silence, Sheridan felt something shift beneath her feet, though she couldn't have said what. If your own stepmother sold your future to save herself, would you ever call her family again? Say it plainly in the comments below. Sheridan deserves to know she isn't the only woman who stood in that exact kind of silence. Before you go, if this kind of story stays with you, the kind that sits in your chest long after the screen goes dark, there's a novel waiting for you that I think you'll love just as much. 2 powerful stories in one collection, one that will break your heart, and one that will heal it. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments, and if you're watching from your TV right now, just grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. Go on. You've earned a good story. The shift beneath her feet followed Sheridan all the way out of the ballroom, down a marble corridor, and into the back of a car, so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat over the engine. Hyun-jun rode separately, his wheelchair secured into a modified vehicle ahead of hers, and by the time the convoy reached the outer walls of the Kwon estate, night had fully settled over the city. Sheridan pressed her fingers to the window and watched the gates rise out of the darkness. 20 feet of black iron, cameras mounted every few yards, men in dark suits stationed like statues along the drive. This was the part she'd been bracing for since Aliner first spoke Hyun-jun's name in that drawing room. This was where the fear was supposed to start. The gates closed behind her with a low, final sound, sealing away the only world she'd ever known. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for someone to strip away the gentleness of the wedding and show her what she'd really married into. She'd heard the stories, same as everyone in the city had, Kwon Hyun-jun's name spoken in the same breath as men who disappeared, warehouses that burned, rivals who simply stopped showing up to their own lives. She didn't know which of those stories were true. She only knew she was about to live inside whatever was left of them. The car stopped beneath a stone portico lit by lanterns, and a man in a dark coat opened her door before she could reach for the handle herself. Sheridan flinched, an old habit, the kind you build when every hand near you has, at some point, closed around your arm too hard. But the man simply extended his palm, waited for her to take it if she wanted to, and said nothing at all. He didn't rush her. He didn't grip her wrist. He just stood there, patient, like her comfort actually mattered to him. She stepped out slowly, gathering the weight of her gown, and looked up at the compound for the first time. It rose in front of her like something out of a dream she hadn't asked for, stone and glass, ivy climbing one whole wing, warm light glowing behind curtained windows. Beautiful, fortified. A cage with good lighting, she thought, and immediately hated herself for how close she was to crying again. Hyun-jun was already inside by the time she crossed the threshold, his wheelchair angled near the base of a wide staircase, a woman in a gray uniform standing a respectful distance behind him. He looked up when Sheridan entered, and for one unbearable second neither of them spoke. She braced herself the way she'd braced herself her whole life, shoulders in, chin down, waiting for the first order, the first cutting word, the first taste of what her new life would cost her. "This is Jaewon," he said instead, nodding toward the woman in gray. "She runs the house. Whatever you need, clothes, meals, anything, you ask her directly, not through me." Sheridan blinked. "I don't understand." "You will have your own wing," he continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "Private quarters, a private entrance, staff who answer to you inside those walls. No one enters without your permission. Not staff, not guards, not me." She searched his face for the catch, the condition, the moment the kindness would reveal itself as a leash in disguise. Elinor had taught her that generosity always had a price, that softness was just cruelty waiting for the right moment to collect. But Hyun-jun simply watched her with the same stillness he'd carried at the altar, no demand behind his eyes, no ledger being kept. "Why?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close to one, gone before it could fully form. "Because you didn't choose this," he said. "I won't make it worse than it already is." Jaewon led her upstairs to a wing that felt like its own small house. High windows, soft light, a sitting room with shelves half filled with books she suspected no one had touched in years. Sheridan stood in the center of it for a long time after Jaewon left her alone, turning slowly, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. It didn't. The door had a lock, and it locked from her side. For the first time since her father's funeral, she was standing in a room that was entirely, undeniably hers. She didn't sleep much that first night. She told herself it was the strangeness of the house, the unfamiliar sounds settling into old stone, the weight of the day finally catching up to her chest. But mostly it was the guards, not because they frightened her, though God knew they should have, but because of the way they looked at her when she wandered the hallway near midnight, unable to sit still. They didn't leer. They didn't speak to her the way men usually spoke to a woman alone in a house full of them. They simply straightened, nodded, and let her pass, their eyes tracking not her but the space around her, like she was something to be guarded rather than something to be managed. It was near dawn, restless and craving air that didn't smell like candle wax and old grief, that Sheridan found her way to the east wing and paused outside a half-open door. Through the gap she could see a private therapy room, mats on the floor, parallel bars bolted into the wall, a physical therapist's clipboard resting on a chair. And Hyun-jun, alone at the bars, gripping them with both hands. She should have looked away. She told herself later that she meant to, but something in the way he held himself stopped her, not the posture of a man straining against a body that had failed him, but something else. Controlled, deliberate, like a man rehearsing a lie he needed to get exactly right. He caught sight of her reflection in the window's dark glass before she could retreat, and for one unguarded second, his eyes weren't the eyes of a paralyzed man fighting to stand. They were sharp, aware, almost amused, the way a man looks when he's been caught at something and isn't entirely sorry for it. Then the moment closed, quick as a door, and he lowered himself back into the chair with the same slow, careful movements she'd watched him use all day. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, wheeling toward her without a trace of embarrassment. I didn't mean to intrude. She should have left it there. Instead, before she could stop herself, she added, You don't move like a man who's given up on walking. It was the wrong thing to say and the right thing to notice, both at once, and she watched something behind his eyes recalibrate, quick and careful, the way a man adjusts a mask that slipped half an inch. Physical therapy is slow, he said evenly. It rewards patience. I have very little of it. It was a good answer. Smooth, reasonable. And yet Sheridan found herself standing in that hallway a moment longer than she should have, turning the sentence over the way her father used to turn over a shipping manifest that didn't quite add up. The numbers technically correct, and still, somehow, wrong. She didn't ask him anything else that night. She only said goodnight and returned to her wing, where she sat by the window until the sky turned pale gray, unable to shake the small, insistent question forming in the back of her mind. If he truly couldn't feel his legs, why had his hands gripped those bars like a man holding himself back, not up? By morning, sunlight spilled gold across her new sitting room, warm and undeserved, and for a moment Sheridan let herself simply breathe. No one had shouted at her. No one had reminded her of her place. She had a door that locked from the inside and a household of armed men who treated her like something worth protecting rather than something worth spending. It felt absurdly like relief. And that unsettled her more than anything else could have, because in her experience, relief was rarely free, and the last time she'd let her guard down this completely, it had cost her everything. If your own family stole your inheritance and forced you to smile through it, would you have found the strength to walk through those gates the way Sheridan did? Tell me honestly in the comments, because a woman doesn't survive what she survived by accident, and she deserves to hear that from you. That relief cost her nothing that first week, and by the second, Sheridan had almost convinced herself it never would. Almost, because a lifetime with a leaner had taught her that almost was the most dangerous word in the language. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered not by Hyun-jun himself but by Jaewon, who appeared at Sheridan's door just after 7 with a simple message. The chairman dines at 9. You're welcome to join him if you'd like. Not an order, not a summons. A door left open, the choice still hers to make. Sheridan almost declined out of habit. She'd spent so many years learning to make herself small at mealtimes, to eat quickly and clear the plates before anyone noticed she'd taken a seat at all. But something in her, something that had been slowly uncurling since the gates closed behind her, wanted to know the man she'd married. Not the name the city feared, the man. She found him in a private dining room at the back of the house, a long table set for 2 despite the fact that either one of them could have eaten in silence, alone in their own wings, and no one would have questioned it. Candles instead of the harsh overhead light. No guard standing sentinel inside the room, though she suspected several waited just beyond the door. He didn't rise when she entered. Couldn't, she reminded herself, though the reminder came with a small, persistent itch of doubt she still hadn't named. He simply gestured to the chair across from him. You didn't have to come, he said. You didn't have to ask. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. They ate in a silence that should have felt awkward and instead felt strangely companionable, the kind of quiet Sheridan hadn't experienced at a dinner table since her father died. Eliner's table had never been silent. It had been a courtroom, every meal a trial where Sheridan was perpetually the defendant and never once the judge. It was Hyun-jun who broke the quiet first, which surprised her more than anything else that night. Your father, he said. He ran a shipping company. Combs Logistics. Before my stepmother restructured it into something with her name on the letterhead and my father's blood in the walls. She hadn't meant to say it that sharply. She waited for him to change the subject, the way people always did when grief got too specific for comfortable conversation. He didn't. What did he teach you? So she told him. Not everything. Not yet. Not the ledgers hidden in her coat lining. Not the years of swallowed rage. But enough. She told him about learning to read a bill of lading before she could read a novel, about riding along on her father's route inspections as a girl, about the particular music of a warehouse running efficiently, every crate exactly where it needed to be. She hadn't spoken about her father this long to another living person in 6 years. and she found, to her own surprise, that Hyun-jun listened the way almost no one ever had, not waiting for his turn to speak, not glancing toward the door, not performing patience. Actually listening, as though her voice were the only sound worth hearing in a city built entirely on noise. "You still think in roots," he said finally. "I watched you at the window this morning. You were looking at the delivery trucks in the courtyard like you were auditing them." Sheridan felt heat rise in her cheeks. Old habit. Useful one? He was quiet a moment, weighing something. Then, "My syndicate moves product through 6 ports on the eastern corridor. Legitimate shipping fronts, mostly. Textiles, machine parts. 2 months ago, we started losing inventory on the Busan to Coast route. Small amounts. Consistent. My people assumed theft at the dock." "May I see the manifests?" He studied her for a long moment, and Sheridan understood, somewhere beneath her collarbone, that this was a test. Not cruel, not designed to trap her, but real all the same. A man like Hyun-jun didn't share syndicate business with a stranger, wife or not, unless he'd already decided something about her worth trusting. He nodded to a folder at the end of the table, one she hadn't noticed until that moment, and she wondered whether he'd brought it down deliberately or whether some instinct in him had simply known she'd ask. She spread the pages beside her plate, forgetting the food entirely, tracing the delivery windows with one finger the way her father used to. It took her less than 10 minutes. "It's not theft," she said. "Look, the losses only happen on shipments that transfer through the Incheon relay point, and only on the 2nd Tuesday of the month. That's not a thief. Thieves are greedy and inconsistent. This is someone who knows your audit schedule and is skimming exactly enough to stay under the threshold that triggers a formal review." She looked up at him. "Someone inside your organization built this pattern on purpose. Someone who knows exactly how closely you're watching." Something shifted in Hyun-jun's face. Not shock, she realized, but recognition, as if she'd confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying alone for weeks and hadn't trusted anyone enough to say aloud. "You found in 10 minutes what my logistics chief couldn't find in 2 months. Your logistics chief wasn't looking for a pattern, he was looking for a thief." She closed the folder gently. "Those are different crimes." He watched her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and at the same time, made her want very badly not to. She understood, in that moment, sitting at a candlelit table across from a man the entire underworld feared, that she had just handed him something valuable, information that could expose a traitor inside his own house, information he could have paid a dozen accountants to spend months chasing. She held, without meaning to, a small piece of power inside his world, and the realization sat strange and unfamiliar in her chest. She could have kept it to herself. She could have stayed quiet, stayed small, the way Alina had trained her to. Instead, she'd handed him a shield instead of a weapon, and she wasn't entirely sure why that had felt like the only possible choice. "Why help me?" he asked quietly. "You didn't ask for any of this. The wedding, the house, my enemies. You could sit in that wing upstairs and let my syndicate rot around me. It would cost you nothing." Sheridan considered the question honestly, the candlelight flickering low between them. "Because I know what it feels like to have people you trusted circle you quietly, waiting for the right moment to take everything," she said. "I couldn't stop it happening to me. I can stop it happening to you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of 2 people who had both been betrayed by the ones who should have protected them, recognizing something steady and unguarded in each other for the first time. Sheridan noticed, not for the first time but more clearly than before, the particular stillness of his hands where they rested near the folder, strong hands, capable hands, hands that didn't tremble the way a man's should after months confined to a chair. She noticed it and set the thought aside, the way she'd been setting aside small, inconvenient observations since her first night in this house. "There's a name I need," he said instead, all business again, though something warmer lingered beneath it. "Whoever built that pattern knew our audit calendar. That's not doc information. That's inner circle." "Then it's someone close to you." "Yes," he said, and for the briefest moment, something dark and unreadable passed behind his eyes, not aimed at her, but at whoever waited, unnamed, somewhere inside these very walls. "Closer than you'd think." Sheridan felt the warmth of the evening cool by a few careful degrees, replaced by something sharper, more alert. She had just made herself useful to a dangerous man in a house full of secrets, and somewhere in this compound, someone she hadn't met yet already knew her name, her face, and now, perhaps, the fact that she'd just made herself his enemy. If a man treated you with more honesty in 2 weeks than your own family managed in years, would you let yourself trust him, even knowing trust has cost you everything before? Tell me in the comments. Sheridan's answer might surprise you. That unnamed enemy stayed on Sheridan's mind for 3 days. A low hum of unease beneath the otherwise gentle rhythm the household had settled into. And it was still their Thursday evening when she wandered into the estate library, looking for something to quiet her thoughts before bed. The library occupied the entire west corner of the house, 2 stories of dark wood shelving reaching toward a ceiling painted with something faded and old. Ladders on brass rails leaning against the higher shelves like they hadn't been touched in years. Sheridan had discovered it her 2nd week in the house and had been slowly working her way through it ever since, grateful for a room that asked nothing of her except quiet. She wanted something on maritime trade routes that night, something to keep her hands busy and her mind further from the folder of manifests still sitting on her nightstand, further from the sharp, dark look that had passed behind Hyun-jun's eyes 3 nights ago when he'd said closer than you'd think. She found the book near the top of a shelf too tall for her to reach comfortably, and rather than fetch the ladder from across the room, she stretched onto her toes, fingers grazing the spine, closer, until her sleeve caught the edge of a bronze statue perched on the shelf beside it, a heavy antique piece, some old warrior figure Hyun-jun's grandfather had apparently collected, solid metal and easily 40 pounds. It tipped. For one suspended, silent second. Sheridan watched it rock on its base, watched her own hand miss the catch by inches, and understood with total clarity that it was about to fall directly toward her skull. She didn't even have time to scream. What she had time for was this, a blur of motion at the edge of her vision, faster than anything she'd seen in that house, faster than anything a man confined to a wheelchair for months should have been physically capable of producing. And then Hyun-jun was simply there, upright, both feet planted flat on the library floor, one arm raised to catch the full weight of the bronze inches from her face, while the other hand closed firm and sure around her waist, pulling her back and down out of the statue's path in the same fluid motion. The bronze landed against his forearm with a heavy, muffled thud instead of against her skull with a sound she didn't let herself imagine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Sheridan stood frozen inside the circle of his arm, her back pressed against his chest, staring down at legs that were supposed to be dead weight beneath a blanket, legs that were instead holding both their combined weight with the effortless balance of a man who had never lost the use of them at all. The wheelchair sat empty and abandoned 6 feet away, tipped slightly where he'd shoved off from it, and the sight of it, empty, useless, a prop with nothing left to prove, hit Sheridan harder than the statue nearly had. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, "You're standing." He didn't answer right away. His hand was still at her waist, warm and steady, and she could feel the tension in his arm where the bronze statue rested against his forearm like it weighed nothing at all. Slowly, carefully, he lowered it to the floor, the sound of metal against wood unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the room. Then, and only then, did he release her, taking one deliberate step back, putting distance between them that felt less like courtesy and more like a man giving himself room to think. Sheridan! Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had all the nights before, lower, more careful, weighted with something that hadn't been there at their quiet dinners. "You've been walking this whole time." She turned to face him fully now, her heart still hammering from the near miss, from the impossible sight of him upright, from the sudden dismantling of every assumption she'd carried into this marriage. The wheelchair, the physical therapy sessions, the all of it. It's been an act. Not all of it. His voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this exact conversation in his mind 100 times and hoped never to have it. The accident was real. The injury was real. For a while, I couldn't walk at all. He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. That part ended months ago. Months. Sheridan felt the word land like a stone in her stomach. You've been able to walk for months, and you let everyone believe. You let me believe. I let everyone believe it because the men who did this to me are still out there, still waiting to see whether they succeeded. His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, and beneath the calm she could see something else now, something coiled and dangerous that had nothing to do with the gentle man who'd asked about her father over candlelight. The car that nearly killed me wasn't an accident, Sheridan. It was an ambush. Someone inside my own organization ordered it, someone who wanted me broken enough to lose control of the syndicate without ever having to spill blood in the open. If they'd known I recovered, they would have finished the job properly the second time. She stared at him, pieces rearranging themselves rapidly in her mind. The strength in his hands she'd noticed and dismissed a dozen times, the way he'd gripped the therapy bars like a man holding back rather than pushing forward, the flicker of sharp awareness she'd caught in his reflection that first sleepless night. She hadn't imagined any of it. Some quiet, careful part of her had known for weeks, and she'd simply refused to let herself believe it, the same way she'd refused to believe, for years, that Aliner's cruelty had ever really been about her at all rather than about money. The pattern I found, she said slowly, the pieces clicking together with a speed that left her slightly breathless. The skimming on the Busan route, that's not just theft. That's someone inside your circle testing how closely you're watching, isn't it? Someone who thinks you're still exactly where that ambush left you. Something like respect moved across his face, quick and genuine, even in the middle of everything else churning between them. Yes. Who else knows that you can walk? No one. The word landed heavy in the quiet library, heavy with implication. Not my lieutenants, not my closest guards, no one but the 2 doctors who treated me privately, and now you. He took a step closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, and his voice dropped lower, quieter, edged with something that was not quite a threat and not quite a plea. If you scream right now, if anyone in this house hears what you just saw, they'll know I'm ready for them before I'm ready to move. Every man circling me right now believes he has time. The moment that changes, I lose the only advantage I have left. Sheridan's pulse was still racing, but not, she realized slowly, from fear of him. She thought of Aliner's forged signatures, of Chloe's careless cruelty, of every secret her own family had kept from her for their own gain, secrets that had cost her everything simply because she hadn't known enough, soon enough, to protect herself. And here was a man handing her the single most dangerous truth of his life, not because he had to, but because in the space of a single accident, he'd decided she was someone worth trusting with it. I won't scream, she said quietly, and meant it with a certainty that surprised her. But you're going to tell me everything. Who did this to you? Who you think is still working against you inside these walls? I've spent my whole life being kept in the dark by people who claimed they were protecting me. I won't live inside that kind of lie again, not even for you. Something shifted in his expression, the last of his guard easing just slightly, replaced by a look she didn't yet have a name for, warm and searching and entirely too close to the way she'd started, against every instinct she owned to look at him too. Then sit down, he said, gesturing to the 2 chairs near the cold fireplace, his own legs, strong, steady, undeniably alive, carrying him there without a single trace of hesitation. Because once I tell you, Sheridan, there's no walking either of us back out of this. She sat, and for the first time since her father died, Sheridan understood that the truth, however dangerous, was infinitely safer than another beautiful lie. Which betrayal cuts deeper to you, a stepmother stealing a birthright, or a man hiding the one truth that could have kept his enemies guessing? Tell me below. Sheridan's about to find out exactly how far that secret runs. She sat, and the truth Hyun-jun gave her that night was infinitely more dangerous than she'd braced herself for. My cousin, he said, once the fire had been lit low and the library door secured, Minyi, you've seen his name on the shipping ledgers. He's my second in command. He's also the man who arranged the ambush that put me in that wheelchair. Sheridan sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, though inside her chest something had gone cold and sharp. Your own blood. Blood means less than people believe in this world. His voice carried no self-pity, only the flat, weary certainty of a man who had already made peace with the wound. Minyi grew up 2 houses down from mine. We ran these streets together as boys. When my father died and the crown passed to me instead of him, he said all the right things, congratulated me at the funeral, swore his loyalty at every meeting since. He paused, his jaw tightening in the firelight. And 6 months ago, he had my car's brakes cut on the coastal road, timed for a curve where the drop would look like an accident to anyone who didn't know to look closer. But you survived. I survived because the driver swerved half a second before he should have, and God, luck, or plain stubbornness decided I wasn't finished yet. He looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had caught 40 pounds of falling bronze without a flicker of hesitation. I woke up in a private hospital with half my spine bruised and swelling that every doctor in the room agreed would likely be permanent. And for 3 weeks, it was. I couldn't feel my legs at all. And then you could. Sheridan's voice was quiet. And then I could. He met her eyes. Slowly, privately, 2 doctors. Both bound by more loyalty to me than to any hospital board, and neither of them has told a living soul. As far as everyone else in my organization knows, as far as Minyi knows, I am exactly as broken as that car wreck left me. Sheridan felt the shape of it settle into place, cold and precise. You kept the wheelchair, the therapy sessions, all of it, not because you needed to hide an injury anymore. She looked at him. Because you needed to see who would act like a vulture the moment they thought you couldn't fight back. Yes, the word came out low, almost grateful, as if it had cost him something to say it plainly, and something else entirely to have someone understand it without needing it explained twice. A wounded lion in a den of wolves learns exactly which wolves were only ever pretending to be loyal. Men who visited daily in the first month stopped coming by the 3rd. Men who once waited for my orders started giving them to each other in rooms they thought I couldn't hear from. Minyi has spent 6 months positioning himself as the natural successor to a broken chairman. Every week I stay in that chair, he grows 1 week more confident and 1 week more careless. Sheridan thought of the manifests still folded in her nightstand, of the pattern she'd found in 10 quiet minutes that his own logistics chief had missed for 2 months. The skimming on the Busan route, she said slowly. That's him. I believe so, testing the waters, seeing how much he can move without anyone connected to me noticing, because a broken chairman doesn't audit closely, and a broken chairman's wife shouldn't be capable of finding patterns his own people can't see. Something flickered across his face, something that might have been pride if the moment weren't so heavy with danger. You've already made yourself more dangerous to him than you realize, Sheridan. If Minyi ever learns what you found, and what you're capable of finding again, you become a problem he'll want solved. The fire popped low in the grate. Sheridan sat with that sentence a long moment, turning it the way she turned everything now, slowly, carefully, checking every angle for the lie hidden inside the truth. She thought of Aliner's hands closing around her chin in the dressing room, of Chloe's crossed arms and dry eyes as Sheridan was dressed in another woman's wedding gown. She thought of every year she'd spent making herself small and quiet and useful enough not to be discarded, and how none of that smallness had ever once kept her safe. It had only kept her invisible to the people who might have helped her, and painfully visible to the ones who wanted to use her. Then let him come, she said. Hyun-jun looked at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You understand what you're saying. If this house ever learns you knew, if Minyi ever suspects you're the reason his skimming was uncovered before he was ready, there will be no gentle version of what he does to protect himself. I understand exactly what I'm saying. Her voice didn't shake, and that surprised her more than anything else that night. I have spent 6 years being quietly erased by people who shared my blood and never once shared my loyalty. My stepmother stole my father's company within a month of his funeral. My stepsister sold me into this marriage without blinking and never once looked back to see if I survived it. She held his gaze steady. You are the first person since my father died who has told me the truth, even when the truth put you at risk. I would rather stand beside a man who's honest about the danger than sit safely inside a house built entirely on lies. Something moved through his expression then, quiet and profound, the look of a man who had spent months learning exactly who in his life could be trusted and had just discovered, unexpectedly, one more name to add to a very short list. "Then we do this together," he said. "Quietly. You keep finding the patterns in the ledgers, the things a syndicate accountant would never think to look for. I keep playing the broken chairman a little longer, long enough to let Minyi believe he's already won. And when he finally moves against me, believing I have no legs left to stand on, he'll find out exactly how wrong he was." Sheridan finished the sentence for him, and for the first time since the wedding, she felt something close to steady ground beneath her feet. It was somewhere in the quiet that followed, the fire burning low and comfortable between them, that the question rose in Sheridan's mind, unbidden and impossible to fully set aside. If Minyi had been circling this house for 6 months, watching, waiting, testing, how many of the guards standing loyal watch outside her own door right now had already, quietly, chosen his side over Hyunjun's? She didn't ask it aloud. Some fears were better carried in silence until you knew enough to survive the answer. "There's something else," Hyunjun said, and his voice had shifted, lower now, careful in a different way than before. "Minyi isn't only circling my chair. He's been asking questions about my marriage, about you, about why a man supposedly broken beyond recovery would suddenly take a bride at all, unless he had reason to believe his position needed shoring up." Sheridan felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cooling fire. "He thinks I'm part of a plan." "I think," Hyunjun said slowly, "that Minyi is far more perceptive than I've given him credit for, and that the safest thing I ever did for this family may also turn out to be the most dangerous thing I've ever asked of you." He reached across the small distance between their chairs, not quite touching her, his hand resting open on the arm of her seat, an offer rather than a claim. "I won't pretend this is a small thing I'm asking. If you want out of this house, out of this war that was never yours to inherit, I will find a way to protect you from a distance and never ask you to carry this secret another day." Sheridan looked at his open hand, then at his face, steady and unguarded in the firelight in a way she suspected very few people in his entire dangerous world had ever been permitted to see. She thought of Aliner's cold grip. She thought of her father's brass watch, hidden in silk lining, the only piece of honesty she had left from the family that raised her. And she understood, with a clarity that felt less like fear and more like coming home, that she had already chosen her side the moment she'd chosen to knock on that manifest folder instead of walking past it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and placed her hand over his. "Whatever's coming for you is coming for me too, Hyunjun. I'd rather face it standing beside the one person in this house who's been honest with me than run back to the people who never were." His fingers closed gently around hers, and in the low firelight of that library, surrounded on every side by men who might already be counting down the days until they turned traitor, Sheridan Combs made her choice. Not the choice her stepmother forced on her at the altar, but the first true choice she'd made for herself in 6 long years. And somewhere beyond those fortified walls, in a room she would never be invited into, Minyi was already making plans of his own, plans that would soon reveal exactly how many wolves had been sleeping under this roof all along. If this story has you holding your breath the way it's held mine writing it, do something for me. Support the channel and grab the novel collection linked in the description and pinned in the comments. 2 full stories, one that will break your heart wide open and one that will piece it gently back together, are waiting for you whenever you're ready. If you're watching from your TV tonight, the QR code is right there on your screen. Scan it, hold on to it, and let's keep going together. Minyi wasn't the only shadow moving through that house with plans of his own. Sheridan learned that a week later, when Hyunjun called her into his private study and set a slim leather folder on the desk between them without a word of preamble. "You asked me once why I trusted you so quickly," he said, watching her face as she reached for it. "This is why I decided to trust you back." Sheridan opened the folder slowly, and the first thing she saw was her father's name, typed clean across the top of a scanned document she recognized instantly. The transfer of ownership filing for Combs Logistics, the one Aliner had waved in front of her the week of the funeral like a closed case. A done deal, nothing left to discuss. Sheridan had read that document a dozen times in the weeks after her father's death, back when grief still had enough room in her chest for outrage. She'd memorized the date at the bottom. She'd never once questioned the signature above it, because why would a grieving daughter question her own father's handwriting? I had my intelligence team pull the original filing from the county registrar, Hyun-jun said, his voice even, careful, the voice of a man delivering news he already suspected would land like a blow. Along with 3 years of your father's notarized business documents for comparison. Sheridan's fingers found the second page in the folder, a forensic handwriting analysis, clinical and precise, laid out in columns she didn't fully understand but understood enough. Loop formation inconsistent, pressure variance outside normal range, signature executed under different pen grip than baseline samples. And at the bottom, in plain, unmerciful language, signature on filing dated 11 days after decedent's date of death does not match verified exemplars with statistical confidence exceeding 98%. 11 days, Sheridan whispered. My father died on a Tuesday. The funeral was that Saturday. She looked up at Hyun-jun. Her hands were not quite steady. She filed this before we'd even finished burying him. She filed it, Hyun-jun said quietly, using a signature that wasn't his. Your father never signed that transfer, Sheridan. He couldn't have. He was already gone. Sheridan sat very still, the folder open in her lap, and felt something break loose in her chest that she'd been holding shut for 6 years. Not new grief, but old grief finally given permission to be angry instead of merely sad. She had spent years believing her father's final act had been a betrayal, some late confession of financial desperation that made Aliner's takeover feel almost forgivable, almost necessary. She had built a quiet, private peace around that belief, the same way she'd built peace around every other cruelty in that house, by convincing herself there was a reasonable explanation buried somewhere beneath the pain. And it had all been a lie. Her father hadn't handed his company to Aliner in some final act of trust. Aliner had simply reached into his cold hand and forged what she needed while the ink on his death certificate was still wet. Why, Sheridan said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. Would she move that fast? Most people wait. Most people at least pretend to grieve before they start dividing the assets. It was a fair question, and Hyun-jun's silence told her he didn't yet have the full answer, only pieces of it. My team is still working that thread, he admitted. There's a debt buried somewhere in your father's private accounts, something Aliner knew about and moved quickly to bury along with him. We haven't found the full shape of it yet. He paused. But whatever it is, Sheridan, I don't believe your stepmother forged that signature out of simple greed. I believe she was running from something, and your father's company was the fastest thing she could grab to outrun it. That single unanswered thread, the shape of a debt no one had yet named, settled into Sheridan's mind like a splinter she couldn't quite reach, small and persistent beneath everything else she was trying to process. Aliner had always played the role of a woman who wanted for nothing, who wore her control like jewelry, effortless and untouchable. If there was a debt hiding somewhere beneath that performance, Sheridan couldn't yet imagine what it was, or how deep it ran, or what her stepmother had been so afraid of that she'd forge a dead man's signature rather than wait even one respectful week. She didn't have long to sit with the question. 2 days later, Jaewon knocked on her sitting room door with an expression Sheridan hadn't seen on the housekeeper's face before. Careful, slightly wary, the look of someone delivering news she wasn't sure would be welcome. There's a woman at the gate, Jaewon said. She says she's your sister. Sheridan's stomach dropped, quick and cold. Stepsister, she corrected automatically, and then, because some old habit of politeness still lived in her even now, let her in. Chloe arrived in the sitting room 10 minutes later, looking nothing like the glittering, dismissive girl who'd stood dry-eyed and cross-armed through Sheridan's wedding. Her makeup was careful, but couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes. Her designer coat looked expensive and slightly wrinkled, the coat of a woman who'd been wearing it too many days in a row. She stood in the doorway of Sheridan's private wing, the wing with its own entrance, its own staff, its own lock that answered only to Sheridan. And for the first time in Sheridan's memory, Chloe looked genuinely small. You look well, Chloe said, glancing around the room with an expression caught somewhere between envy and calculation. Married life suits you. What do you want, Chloe? The bluntness seemed to catch her stepsister off guard, and for a moment the practiced composure slipped. "I need money," Chloe said, the words coming out fast, almost desperate, like she'd rehearsed a gentler version of this conversation and abandoned it the second she saw Sheridan's face. "There's a debt. It's larger than I expected it to become, and Mother won't help me, and I thought, given everything, given how well things have clearly worked out for you here." "How much?" Chloe named a number that made Sheridan's jaw tighten, a number far beyond the reach of ordinary bad luck. The kind of number that came from months, maybe years, of decisions made by someone who genuinely believed consequences were things that happened to other people. "Gambling," Sheridan said. It wasn't really a question. Chloe's chin lifted, defensive even now, even here, standing in the house of the family she'd sold her stepsister into. "It doesn't matter how. It matters that I need it, and you have access to more money in this house than either of us has ever seen in our lives." Sheridan looked at her stepsister for a long, quiet moment and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, though rage would have been reasonable, and not pity, though some old, worn-down part of her searched for it out of habit. What she felt instead was clarity, cold and complete. Chloe had stood in that dressing room 3 months ago and watched Sheridan be laced into a wedding gown meant for someone else's life, and she had not once, not for a single second, offered to trade places. She had not apologized. She had not even asked, in all the weeks since, whether Sheridan had survived the marriage she'd been forced into. And now here she stood, in Sheridan's own private wing, asking for money as though nothing between them required repair before it required rescue. "You didn't come to see if I was alive," Sheridan said quietly. "You didn't come to apologize for what you and Mother did to me. You came because you're in debt, and you remembered I might be useful again." "That's not fair." "It's exactly fair." Sheridan kept her voice level, though something steady and long overdue was rising in her chest, something that felt, for the first time, like power rather than pain. "You have spent your whole life certain that I would always be the one absorbing the consequences of this family's choices. I want you to sit with the fact that today, for the first time, that isn't true anymore." Chloe's composure cracked fully then, tears rising fast and genuine, the tears of a woman realizing the ground beneath her had shifted without her permission. "Sheridan, please. You don't understand how bad this has gotten. If I don't pay this by the end of the month, the people I owe, they're not the kind of people who send polite reminders." Something in that sentence caught, sharp and unexpected, in the back of Sheridan's mind. A small, cold flicker of recognition she couldn't yet name. Some instinct telling her that the shape of Chloe's debt and the shape of whatever Alina had been running from all those years ago might not be two separate stories after all, but the same story, told twice, a generation apart. She didn't say that thought aloud. She wasn't ready to chase it yet, not with Chloe still standing in front of her, mascara streaked, hands trembling around a purse that probably cost more than Sheridan had earned scrubbing that family's floors in an entire year. "I'll think about it," Sheridan said finally, which was more mercy than Chloe had ever once shown her, and watched her stepsister's face flood with relief before Sheridan added, quiet and unhurried, "But you should know. Your mother forged my father's signature 11 days after he died. I have the proof sitting in a file not 20 feet from where you're standing. So before you ask me for another favor, Chloe, I'd think very carefully about which one of us actually still has something left to lose." The color drained from Chloe's face so fast it was almost satisfying to watch. And in the silence that followed, Sheridan understood, with a certainty that felt like the ground finally leveling beneath her feet, that the woman who'd once been forced into a stranger's wedding dress no longer had to beg anyone in that family for mercy. Now they would have to come begging to her. If you discovered the man you married had been hiding a secret that dangerous, would you have run the moment you found out, or stayed and fought beside him the way Sheridan chose to? Tell me honestly in the comments, because not every woman would have made her choice, and I think that says something about the kind of woman she really is. That ground Sheridan had finally felt beneath her feet began to tremble again exactly 9 days later, when Jaiwan appeared in her sitting room just after breakfast with a folded note and an expression Sheridan had learned to read as trouble. "The chairman needs you in the East Conference room," Jaiwan said. "Now, if you're able." Sheridan found Hyun-jun standing at the tall windows of his study, no wheelchair in sight, his shoulders set in the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as the calm before something dangerous. He turned when she entered, and the look on his face told her everything before he said a single word. "Minyi has called a summit," he said. "Tonight, every affiliated boss in the Eastern Corridor has been invited, along with half the independent operators who owe either of us favors. He's framing it as a leadership review, a formal check on my fitness to continue as chairman, given my, as he's put it in the invitation, ongoing physical limitations." Sheridan felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though she kept her voice steady. "He's making his move. He's making his move in front of witnesses, which means he's confident enough in his numbers to risk doing this publicly instead of quietly." Hyun-jun's jaw was tight, controlled, but Sheridan had spent enough late nights across a dinner table from this man to see the tension coiled beneath his composure. "A public vote to remove me isn't just a threat to my leadership, Sheridan. In this world, a chairman stripped of his title in front of his peers rarely survives the humiliation long enough to rebuild. Minyi isn't just trying to replace me tonight. He's trying to make sure there's nothing left of me to replace." Sheridan crossed the room and sat across from him, forcing her hands still in her lap the way she'd learned to do years ago at a leaner's table, when showing fear had only ever invited more of it. "Then, we give him a summit he isn't prepared for." Hyun-jun studied her for a long moment, something sharpening behind his eyes. Not fear, she realized, but calculation, the look of a man already 3 moves ahead and searching to see if she'd arrived at the same square. "You have something." "I have the shipping ledgers," she said. "The skimming pattern on the Busan route, tied directly to authorizations only someone in Minyi's position could access. It's not proof of the ambush, not yet, but it's proof he's been quietly stealing from the syndicate while positioning himself as its savior. Put that in front of every boss in that room, and it stops being a vote about your legs. It becomes a question about his loyalty." "That's not enough on its own to save me," Hyun-jun said quietly. "Men like the ones coming tonight don't care about a little skimming. They care about strength. If I sit in that chair while Minyi makes his case, if I let him paint me as broken in front of every rival who's been waiting years for an opening." "Then don't sit in the chair," Sheridan said. The words hung in the room between them, simple and enormous all at once. Hyun-jun went very still. "You've been building toward this moment for 6 months," Sheridan continued, leaning forward. "Every day you stayed in that wheelchair, you were gathering exactly this, a room full of men who believe you're finished, gathered in one place at one time, with the man who orchestrated your downfall standing close enough to touch. You don't need to survive their vote, Hyun-jun. You need to end it." Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before, not quite hope, something steadier and more dangerous than that. Resolve. "If I stand up in that room tonight," he said slowly, "there's no walking it back. Every enemy I have will know exactly what I'm capable of. Minyi will know I let him believe a lie for 6 months, which means he'll assume I'm capable of far worse than he imagined." "Good," Sheridan said. "Let him assume it." By the time evening fell over the estate, the compound had transformed into something Sheridan hadn't seen since the wedding. Cars gliding up the long drive in steady procession, black suits and low voices filling the great hall, guards doubled at every entrance, their eyes sharper, their hands never far from their coats. Sheridan stood at the top of the staircase in a dark, tailored dress Jaiwon had helped her choose that afternoon, watching the underworld of the Eastern Corridor gather beneath the chandeliers of a house that had, for a few quiet months, felt almost like a sanctuary. She recognized the tension the moment she stepped down into the main hall, an electric, watchful current running beneath the polite greetings and clinking glasses, the particular silence of powerful men circling each other, waiting to see which way the wind would break. Minyi stood near the head of the long conference table, dressed sharply, smiling easily, greeting each arriving boss with the practiced warmth of a man who had already decided he was the host of this gathering in every way that mattered. Sheridan watched him work the room and felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the particular clarity of finally seeing a threat's full shape after weeks of only sensing its shadow. And then, Near the entrance, a voice she knew far too well cut through the low murmur of the crowd. Sheridan. She turned and felt her stomach drop for an entirely different reason. Alina stood just inside the doorway in an embellished navy gown, composed and glittering, her hand already reaching for Sheridan's arm with the same proprietary confidence she'd carried her whole life. Chloe hovered a step behind her, pale, subdued, clearly still reeling from the conversation in Sheridan's sitting room days before. "What are you doing here?" Sheridan said quietly, though she already suspected the answer. "We were invited," Alina said smoothly, as though the word itself explained everything. "Mr. Minyi reached out personally. He mentioned there might be opportunities, given the leadership changes on the horizon. Investment opportunities for those loyal to the syndicate's future rather than its past." Sheridan felt the pieces click into place with sickening speed. Minyi hadn't just called this summit to strip Hyunjun of his title. He'd reached out to Alina directly, courting her, likely dangling promises of partnership or funding in exchange for whatever leverage or public support she might bring to his cause. Alina, ever hungry for proximity to power, had walked straight into the middle of a war she didn't fully understand, still believing tonight was about opportunity rather than blood. She had no idea what Sheridan carried, folded neatly in the small clutch at her side. The forged signature, the forensic analysis, 6 months of Minyi's careful theft laid out in black and white ink. She had no idea that within the hour, the daughter she'd forced into another woman's wedding dress would be the one holding the evidence to bury them both. "You should leave," Sheridan said quietly. "Whatever Minyi promised you, it's not what you think." Alina's smile thinned, the old familiar coldness sliding back into place beneath the pleasant mask. "I don't need your protection, Sheridan. I've survived far worse storms than one paralyzed mobster losing his grip on power." She glanced past Sheridan's shoulder, toward the head of the table where Minyi stood holding court, and something calculating flickered in her eyes. "Whoever ends up running this syndicate by morning, I intend to be standing close enough to benefit from it." Sheridan watched her stepmother walk further into the room, oblivious to the exact shape of the trap closing around her, and felt something settle inside her chest. Not quite pity, not quite satisfaction, but something steadier than either. Alina had spent her whole life certain she could read every room well enough to bend it to her advantage. Tonight, for the first time, she'd walked into one she didn't understand at all. At the far end of the hall, the doors opened, and every conversation in the room dropped to silence as Kwon Hyunjun was wheeled in, seated, composed, exactly as broken as everyone in that room expected him to be. Sheridan caught his eye across the crowded hall for one brief, charged second, and understood with a clarity that made her pulse quicken. That the man everyone in this room believed they were about to vote against no longer existed, hadn't existed for months. Minyi moved to the head of the table and raised his glass, his smile wide and generous, the smile of a man already tasting victory. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "thank you for coming on short notice. Tonight, we address a matter this family has avoided discussing for far too long, whether a chairman who can no longer stand on his own 2 feet has any business holding this syndicate's crown." The room held its breath. Somewhere near the window, Alina smiled, certain she'd chosen the winning side. Somewhere near the door, Sheridan's hand tightened around her clutch, feeling the weight of the folder inside it, and Kwon Hyunjun sat perfectly, patiently still in his wheelchair, watching the clock over Minyi's shoulder tick down toward the exact second he'd been waiting 6 long months to reach. That second finally arrived when Minyi set his glass down, folded his hands behind his back, and looked directly at Hyunjun with the practiced sympathy of a man rehearsing mercy he had no intention of showing. "Chairman Kwon has served this family with distinction," Minyi said, his voice smooth and carrying, pitched for every boss seated around that long table. "No one questions his history, but history isn't leadership. A syndicate led by a man who cannot walk into his own war rooms, who cannot stand to greet his allies or face his enemies, is a syndicate that invites attack from every rival who smells weakness." He turned slowly, taking in the room, letting the silence stretch. "I propose a vote, tonight. To transfer operational leadership to someone capable of standing at the front of this family, rather than being wheeled behind it." A murmur moved through the gathered men, some nodding slowly, others watching Hyun-jun's face for a reaction he didn't give them. Sheridan stood near the doorway, her pulse hammering, watching Min-yi's confidence swell with every second of silence Hyun-jun allowed him. Across the room, Alina leaned toward another guest, whispering something with a satisfied smile, already imagining herself on the winning side of whatever came next. "You've had 6 months to build this moment, Min-yi." Hyun-jun's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, almost gentle, and it silenced the room instantly. "I have to admire the patience. My father used to say patience was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition." "Your father also believed loyalty mattered more than strength," Min-yi said, something colder sliding beneath his composure now. "Look where that got him. I won't make the same mistake, cousin. This family needs a chairman who can defend it, not one who needs to be carried into every room." "Careful," Hyun-jun said softly. "You're describing a man who no longer exists." Something flickered across Min-yi's face, irritation, maybe the first hairline crack in his certainty, and Sheridan watched his hand drift, almost casually, toward the inside of his jacket. "This isn't a negotiation," he said, his voice sharpening. "It's a formality. The vote will confirm what everyone in this room already knows." His hand emerged holding a pistol, raised without hesitation, leveled directly at the man seated calmly in the wheelchair before him. "Chairman Kwon Hyun-jun is no longer fit to lead this family. Effective immediately." The room erupted into chaos, chairs scraping back, several bosses rising in alarm, Alina's hand flying to her mouth in genuine shock for the first time all evening. Sheridan felt every muscle in her body lock, her hand tightening around the folder in her clutch, every instinct screaming at her to move, to scream, to do something. But she had promised him this moment. She held perfectly still, and she watched. Kwon Hyun-jun looked up at the gun pointed at his chest, and for one final, suspended second, he did not move at all. Then, slowly, deliberately, he planted both hands on the arms of his wheelchair and pushed himself upright. The room went absolutely silent. He rose to his full height in front of 30 of the most dangerous men in the eastern corridor, his shoulders squared, his legs steady beneath him, standing the way he had never once stood in front of any of them in over a year. The wheelchair rolled back an inch behind him, empty, its usefulness finally, permanently spent. Somewhere near the window, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor, the sound obscenely loud in the silence that followed. "You," Min-yi breathed, the gun wavering slightly in his hand, disbelief cracking through his composure for the first time all night. "You've been standing," Hyun-jun said, "for 6 months, long enough to watch every man in this room decide, one careful step at a time, whether he was loyal to this family or only loyal to whoever looked strongest that week." His eyes swept the stunned faces around the table before returning, cold and final, to his cousin. "You made your choice a year ago on a coastal road, when you decided my death was worth more to you than my leadership." "I did what needed to be done," Min-yi said, the gun steadying again, desperation sharpening his voice. "You were going to run this family into the ground exactly like your father." "You cut my brakes," Hyun-jun said, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, each one a small, devastating proof of everything Min-yi had built his entire coup on believing was impossible. "You let me lie in a hospital bed for weeks, unable to feel my own legs, and you smiled at my bedside every single day and called it loyalty." Min-yi's finger tightened on the trigger, and Sheridan's heart stopped in her chest. But Hyun-jun moved faster, closing the last of the distance in a single fluid motion, his hand closing around Min-yi's wrist and wrenching the weapon upward and sideways with a speed and precision that spoke of a body never actually broken at all, only patiently, deliberately hidden. The gun fired once into the ceiling, plaster raining down over the stunned crowd, before Hyun-jun twisted the weapon free and let it clatter to the marble floor. For a moment, the two men stood locked together, cousin against cousin, blood against blood, and the entire room held its breath around them. "Please," Min-yi said, and for the first time all evening, his voice cracked with something that sounded almost like the boy he must have been once, running these same streets as a child beside the man he'd tried to kill. "Hyun-jun, we grew up together. You don't have to." You made this choice a year ago, Hyun-jun said quietly, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only the flat, exhausted certainty of a man closing a door he'd kept open far longer than he should have. I'm only finishing it. What happened next happened fast, too fast for most of the room to fully process before it was already over. A swift, economical motion that ended with Minyi collapsing to the marble floor and the room's collective, horrified silence broken only by the low sound of someone near the back retching quietly into a handkerchief. Sheridan did not look away. She had promised herself, walking into this room, that she would not flinch from whatever truth this house demanded of her, and she held to that promise even now, watching the man she'd married reclaim, in the space of 30 seconds, everything that had been stolen from him on a coastal road a year ago. Hyun-jun straightened slowly, breathing hard, blood on his hands, and turned to face the stunned assembly of bosses still frozen around the table. Minyi orchestrated the ambush that nearly killed me, he said, his voice carrying clean and steady across the silent hall. He has been skimming from this family's shipping routes for 6 months, funding his own rise while pretending loyalty to mine. He gestured, and Sheridan understood the signal, stepping forward at last, her hand finally releasing the folder from her clutch. The shipping ledgers and forensic timelines spread across the head of the table for every boss in that room to see with their own eyes. The proof is here, gentlemen, if any of you require it beyond what you just witnessed. No one at that table required it. Sheridan watched, her pulse still racing, as one by one the assembled bosses lowered their eyes, some out of respect, most out of fear, every single one of them recalculating in real time exactly how badly they had misjudged the man they'd gathered here to depose. It was in the stunned quiet that followed, while Hyun-jun accepted the murmured, hasty pledges of loyalty from men who moments ago had been prepared to vote him out of his own family, that Sheridan noticed something small and strange near the edge of the room. Alina, pale and trembling, was not looking at Minyi's body on the floor at all. She was staring at the ledgers spread across the table, her face draining of every ounce of color, as though she'd recognized something in those pages that had nothing to do with shipping routes at all. Would you have turned Alina away at the gates the moment you saw her walk into that room smiling, or would you have given her one more chance to prove she'd changed? Tell me honestly in the comments, because Sheridan is about to learn exactly why her stepmother's face just went white, and it isn't for the reason any of us expected. Sheridan followed her stepmother's gaze to the ledgers on the table, and understood a half-second before Alina spoke that the color draining from her face had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with recognition. That account number, Alina said, her voice barely a whisper, one shaking finger extending toward a line item buried in the shipping documents Sheridan had laid out. That can't be. Mother, Chloe's voice cracked from beside her, confused, frightened by a fear she didn't yet understand the shape of. Sheridan stepped closer, following the line Alina's trembling finger had landed on, and felt something cold settle in her chest as the pieces she'd been circling for weeks finally clicked into place. The account routing number buried in Minyi's skimmed shipments matched, almost exactly, a private holding account Sheridan had glimpsed once, years ago, in her father's old financial paperwork. An account Alina had always claimed belonged to a charitable trust, untouchable, separate from the company entirely. You knew him, Sheridan said slowly, looking up at her stepmother's ashen face. You knew Minyi. Alina said nothing, which was answer enough. The debt, Sheridan continued, the shape of 6 years of half-truths finally resolving in front of her. The one you were so desperate to bury the week my father died. It wasn't his debt at all, was it? It was yours. You owed this syndicate money, and when my father died, you used his company, my inheritance, to pay off whatever you'd borrowed from men exactly like the ones standing in this room right now. That's not, Alina's voice broke, the composed mask she'd worn Sheridan's entire life finally, completely failing her. You don't understand what it was like, watching your father spend money we didn't have on ships that never turned a profit, on contracts he signed out of sentiment instead of sense. I borrowed against the company's future to keep us from losing everything. And when he died, I had to move fast, before anyone could ask questions about accounts he never knew existed. So you forged his signature. Sheridan's voice was quiet, but it carried across the stunned silence of the hall, every remaining boss and guard listening now, transfixed by the unraveling of a woman who had walked into that room an hour earlier believing herself untouchable. 11 days after he died, Aliner, you forged a dead man's name to steal his daughter's inheritance and cover your own debts, and you let me believe, for 6 years, that he'd simply chosen you over me. Before Aliner could answer, before the silence could stretch a moment longer, the tall double doors at the far end of the hall opened, and 4 federal officers stepped through them, flanked by 2 men in dark suits Sheridan recognized instantly as members of Hyunjun's legal team. The remaining syndicate bosses stiffened at the sight of law enforcement inside these walls, hands drifting toward weapons out of old habit, until Hyunjun raised a single hand, calm and absolute. "Stand down," he said. "They're not here for this family." One of the officers stepped forward, a folder of his own tucked beneath his arm, and addressed the room with the flat, procedural calm of a man who had clearly been briefed on exactly what he'd find. "Aliner Combs." Aliner's spine went rigid. "I don't know what this is about." "Forgery of a legal document, fraudulent transfer of estate assets, and tax evasion related to the acquisition of Combs Logistics," the officer said, unfolding the paper in his hand. "We've been in contact with Mr. Kwon's legal counsel for the past several weeks regarding forensic evidence supporting these charges." Sheridan felt Hyunjun's presence settle beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, and she understood, with a warmth that cut strangely through the cold satisfaction rising in her chest, that this moment hadn't happened by accident. He'd been building this case in parallel with everything else. The syndicate, Minyi, the careful unraveling of 6 months of lies, quietly assembling the machinery that would finally return to her what had been stolen the moment her father's heart stopped beating. "This is absurd," Aliner said, though her voice had lost the commanding certainty it once carried, thinning now into something closer to panic. "I am the rightful owner of that company. I have documents. Documents this forensic report proves were signed after your husband's death," the officer said evenly, nodding toward the second man beside him, who produced a folder identical to the one Hyunjun had first shown Sheridan weeks ago in his study. Along with a secondary filing, submitted this evening by Mr. Kwon's counsel, restoring Sheridan Combs as the sole legitimate heir to her father's estate, based on his authentic, notarized will, one that names her, and only her, as successor to Combs Logistics. Sheridan's breath caught. She hadn't known about the will. She turned to Hyunjun, searching his face, and found him already watching her, something quiet and steady in his expression, the same look he'd worn the night in the library when he'd first trusted her with the truth about his legs. "My team found it 3 weeks ago," he said quietly, just for her. "Filed with a private attorney your father used before Aliner took control of the household finances. I wanted to be certain before I told you. I didn't want to hand you hope only to watch it collapse." Sheridan felt tears rise, hot and sudden, not from grief this time, but from something that had been missing from her chest for 6 long years. The simple, staggering relief of being chosen, deliberately and on paper, by the one person whose love she'd never once doubted. The officer turned back to Aliner. "Ma'am, I'll need you to place your hands where I can see them." "You can't do this," Aliner said, her voice rising now, the last of her composure cracking wide open as 2 officers moved toward her. "Do you understand who I am? Do you understand what family I understand exactly what family you married into, and exactly what you did to the daughter you were meant to protect after him," Hyunjun said, stepping forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. "This family and this syndicate no longer have any use for you." The handcuffs closed around Aliner's wrists with a sharp, metallic click that echoed through the silent hall, and Sheridan watched, motionless, as the sound settled over her like something she'd been waiting 6 years to hear without ever quite letting herself believe it would come. This was the same woman whose hand had once gripped Sheridan's chin hard enough to bruise, the same voice that had ordered her into a stranger's wedding dress without a single word of apology. And now those wrists, the ones that had signed a dead man's name and stripped his daughter of everything she loved, were bound in steel in front of every boss who had once feared her proximity to power. "You gave away my future," Sheridan said quietly, stepping close enough that only Alina could hear her. "The day you forced me into that dress and told me it didn't matter what I wanted. Now you pay for the past." Alina's eyes, wet now, desperate, searched Sheridan's face for some flicker of the girl who used to scrub floors without complaint, the daughter who'd learned never to talk back. She didn't find her. "Sheridan, please, we're family." "You stopped being my family the moment you decided my inheritance was worth more than my future," Sheridan said, and turned away before Alina could answer, before the tears in her stepmother's eyes could soften something that had taken 6 years and one impossible marriage to finally harden into strength. Chloe stood frozen near the wall, watching her mother led toward the doors, her own face pale with the sudden, dawning understanding that whatever safety she'd always assumed her name provided had just evaporated in front of 30 of the city's most dangerous men. "Sheridan," she said, her voice small, "what happens to me?" Sheridan looked at her stepsister for a long moment, at the woman who had refused to marry a man in a wheelchair and handed that fate to someone else without a second thought, who had come begging for money days after leaving Sheridan to survive a dangerous marriage alone. She felt. For the briefest second, the old pull toward mercy, the habit of smoothing things over, of making herself smaller so everyone else's chaos could stay contained. She let the feeling pass through her, without taking root. "That," Sheridan said quietly, "depends entirely on what the investigation into your gambling debts uncovers next." Chloe's face went white, and somewhere behind her, one of the federal officers who had entered with the arrest warrant paused, exchanging a glance with his partner, already reaching for a second folder Sheridan hadn't known existed, one with Chloe's name printed clearly across the top. "What city are you watching this story from tonight? Let me know in the comments, because Sheridan's victory just crossed the ocean of everything that was stolen from her, and I want to know exactly how far it's traveling to reach you." That second folder turned out to hold exactly what everyone in that room already suspected: wire transfers linking Chloe's gambling debts to 2 of the very men who'd financed Minyi's coup. Proof that her stepsister's recklessness hadn't just cost the family money. It had helped fund the plot against Hyun-jun's life. By the time the federal investigation wrapped 6 weeks later, both Alina and Chloe faced separate indictments, their assets frozen, their names stripped from every document tied to the company Sheridan's father had spent his life building. The empire Alina had stolen with a forged signature was returned, in full, to the daughter she'd never once believed capable of holding it. Months passed before Sheridan saw either of them again. It was a gray, quiet morning in early spring when Jaewon came to find her in the estate's rose garden, where Sheridan had taken to spending her mornings now, coffee in hand, reviewing shipping manifests the way her father used to. The ache of missing him finally softened into something closer to pride than grief. "There are 2 women at the front gate," Jaewon said carefully. "They're asking for you by name." Sheridan didn't need to ask who. She found them standing just beyond the iron gates, the same gates that had closed behind her a year ago and sealed away a life she'd once believed was ending. Alina looked smaller than Sheridan remembered, her once immaculate hair now streaked with gray she hadn't bothered to color, her clothes plain in a way that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Chloe stood beside her, thinner, her eyes ringed with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent months learning, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to want for something and not simply be given it. "Sheridan," Alina's voice cracked on the single syllable, all the old command drained out of it entirely. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. The house is gone. The accounts are frozen. I know what we did to you. I know it more now than I ever let myself understand before, but you're the only family either of us has left." Sheridan stood on her side of the gate, the same iron bars that had once locked her inside a life she hadn't chosen now standing firmly between her and the 2 women who had orchestrated it. She felt, standing there, for the space of one long breath, the old pull, the muscle memory of a lifetime spent making herself smaller so someone else's crisis could be managed, absorbed, quietly resolved by the daughter who never said no. She let that old instinct rise, examined it fully, and set it down. "You forged my father's signature 11 days after he died," Sheridan said, her voice steady, without cruelty and without a single trace of the old fear that used to live in her chest whenever Alina raised her voice. "You dressed me in my stepsister's wedding gown and handed me to a man you believed was dangerous, hoping I would simply disappear into whatever happened next, the same way I disappeared into every corner of that house for 6 years. You never once in all that time asked whether I was safe, whether I was surviving, whether I was happy." "I know," Alina whispered, tears sliding freely down her face now. "I know what I am, Sheridan. I've had months to sit with it." "Then you understand why I can't open this gate," Sheridan said gently, and it was gentleness, not coldness, that carried her words now, because she'd finally learned the difference between mercy and self-erasure, between forgiveness and forgetting. "I spent my whole life believing love meant absorbing whatever pain the people around me needed to set down. I'm not that woman anymore. I hope you find peace, both of you. But I won't build it for you, not again, not at my own expense." Chloe's face crumpled. "We're your family." "Family doesn't sell you to save themselves," Sheridan said quietly. "You taught me that, both of you, better than anyone else ever could have. I'm grateful for the lesson. I won't be paying for the mistake twice." She turned and walked back up the long drive toward the house, and she did not look back. Not because it didn't hurt, because it did. A dull, complicated ache that she suspected might live in her chest for the rest of her life in one form or another. But because for the first time since her father died, she understood that closure didn't require an apology she was owed and would likely never receive. It only required her to stop waiting for one. Hyun-jun was waiting for her on the terrace when she returned, and he didn't ask what had happened at the gate. He simply reached for her hand, steady and warm, the same hand that had once caught a falling statue before it could touch her, and let his silence say what words might have complicated. They stood together in the quiet spring morning, watching the last of the fog burn off the gardens, and Sheridan felt something settle inside her that she hadn't fully expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, though there was some of that too, but something steadier. Peace. Earned, hard-won, entirely her own. 3 weeks later, Sheridan stood in the glass-walled boardroom of Combs Logistics for the first time as its rightful chief executive. The company's original name restored to every sign and letterhead, her father's old desk polished and waiting for her in the corner office he'd once occupied. The board, assembled at Hyun-jun's quiet insistence and her own careful diligence, watched as she laid out a restructuring plan built not on the aggressive expansion Alina had always claimed was necessary, but on the steady, deliberate logistics principles her father had taught her as a girl, riding along on his route inspections before she could read a novel on her own. She'd spent the past 2 months auditing every contract, every shipping lane, every partnership the company held, finding, along the way, 3 separate vulnerabilities Alina's leadership had left dangerously exposed. Vulnerabilities Sheridan closed within her first month in the chair, earning the quiet, surprised respect of board members who had assumed, based on nothing but her youth and her stepmother's whispered warnings, that she'd need far longer to find her footing. Hyun-jun attended that first board meeting not as her husband seeking influence, but simply as an observer in the back row, watching her the way he'd watched her that first night in the library, with something warm and unguarded in his expression that had nothing to do with the syndicate or the danger they'd survived together, and everything to do with the woman who had, against every reasonable expectation, become the true partner of his life. "You didn't need to come," she told him afterward, walking beside him through the building's marble lobby, sunlight spilling gold through floor-to-ceiling windows onto a company that finally, fully belonged to her. "I wanted to," he said simply. "Watching you reclaim this feels like watching justice finish something I could only help start." Sheridan slipped her hand into his, and they walked out together into the bright afternoon, past the gleaming Combs Logistics sign that had once borne another family's fingerprints, and now, finally, carried nothing but her father's legacy and her own hard-won strength. She thought of the frightened, weeping bride who had once been forced down an aisle toward a stranger she believed would ruin her life, and she felt, standing here now, an almost unbearable tenderness for that younger version of herself. Not pity, but something closer to pride. The way you'd look back at someone who had survived a storm she never should have had to weather alone. They didn't need revenge anymore. Watching Alina and Chloe stand outside those gates, small and diminished by the very entitlement that once made them feel untouchable, had been its own quiet, sufficient justice. Sheridan's real victory wasn't their downfall. It was this: the company restored, the marriage that began in coercion transformed into something steady and true, a life finally, entirely her own to build. Hand in hand, they walked toward the car waiting at the curb, two survivors who had found, in the wreckage of two broken families, something neither of them had expected to find again. A partnership built not on fear or obligation, but on the rare, unshakable foundation of two people who had chosen, deliberately and against every reasonable instinct, to trust each other completely. If Sheridan's journey from a forced marriage to an empowered queen moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one. And if you want another journey that will stay with you long after the credits roll, the novel collection linked in the description and pinned in the comments is exactly the kind of story that earns its place on your shelf. Two powerful stories, one heartbreak and one healing, waiting for you whenever you're ready. If you're watching from your TV tonight, scan the QR code right there on your screen, and let's keep finding these stories together.